I never told my daughter what I actually kept inside Warehouse 42. When she married that smooth-talking, gold-digging hustler who thought he could play a retired old man like a fiddle, I made a quiet vow to myself that he would never lay his hands on the key. Yet, just as I was sitting comfortably at home, sipping a glass of bourbon, Warrior, my warehouse manager, called, with absolute panic in his voice. He told me my son-in-law had just arrived, carrying bolt cutters and flanked by two men who were clearly armed. I didn't panic. I had been waiting for this exact moment. What I did next would completely shatter his illusion of control, bringing his entire fake world crashing down. If you want to see how this all unfolds, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the stories I share. Also, drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I always love knowing what corner of the world my listeners are tuned in from. It was exactly 11:30 p.m. Rain was pounding against the thick glass windows of my home just outside of Pittsburgh. My name is Harrison Caldwell, and I'm 70 years old. I spent my entire life building an industrial recycling empire out of rust, sweat, and scrap metal. Today, people look at me and just see a quiet, retired widower. They see an ordinary old man working in his garden, enjoying a peaceful evening bourbon. They don't see the man who survived 30 years in the brutal cutthroat world of the steel and scrap industry. I had just poured myself a generous glass of bourbon, the good stuff I keep for special occasions, when my secondary phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany desk. Only a select few have this number, and one of them is Hector Morales. Hector is a 65-year-old veteran who has managed my properties with absolute loyalty for 2 decades. I picked it up. Hector didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was a gruff, gravelly whisper, nearly drowned out by the downpour on his end. He told me it was happening and that Derek was right at gate 4. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, feeling the familiar burn slide down my throat. I asked if he was alone. Hector's breathing was a bit heavy as he replied. He told me no, that Derek had heavy bolt cutters and backup, 2 large men. They were carrying weapons, and Hector could see the outline of handguns beneath their jackets. He asked for my orders, wanting to know if he should engage or trigger the silent alarm. I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to the desk. Picking up my iPad, I tapped the screen to bring up the hidden, high-definition security feed I'd secretly installed weeks ago. The screen flickered to life, offering a crystal-clear night vision view that pierced through the darkness. There he was, my son-in-law, Derek Thorne, the self-proclaimed venture capitalist, wearing a suit that cost more than my very first car. He was standing in the freezing mud of the industrial park, gripping a heavy pair of iron bolt cutters. I watched the rain plaster his perfectly styled hair against his forehead, and I caught the desperate, greedy twitch in his jaw. I told Hector to stand down. My voice was deadly calm. I instructed him not to engage, not to call the police, and to pull back all perimeter guards. I told him to blind the exterior security cameras and leave a completely clear, unobstructed path straight to the main loading dock. Hector hesitated for only a fraction of a second. He knew me far too well to question my sanity. He asked if I was absolutely certain, noting that the men with Derek looked serious trouble. I told him I was entirely sure. Placing my hand on the framed photograph of my late wife, Patty, I told Hector to let him cut the lock and walk right in. Tonight, Derek was digging his own hole, and I was going to watch him step right into it. I hung up and set the phone aside. On the screen, Derek was struggling against the heavy chains locking the outer chain link fence. He looked pathetic, like a rat trying to bite through a steel trap. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him inside that rusted, rundown warehouse. He truly believed he was stepping into financial freedom. He thought. He had just outsmarted a clueless old-school boomer. Watching him finally snap the first lock, the cold knot of anger in my chest tightened even further. To understand how we arrived at this moment, why my daughter's husband was committing a felony in the middle of the night. You have to go back exactly 3 months. You have to look at the precise moment the seed of suspicion was planted, the moment I realized a parasite had attached itself to my family. It was Brooke and Derek's second wedding anniversary. Brooke is my 32-year-old daughter. She is the light of my life, a sweet, trusting soul who runs her own boutique floral design shop. When Patty passed away, I made a silent promise at her graveside that I would protect our daughter from any harm. From heartbreak, failure, and above all, from predatory, greedy men who exploit kindness. Brooke had arranged a celebratory dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I arrived early, wearing a simple but clean suit, happy just to see my daughter smile. Derek showed up 15 minutes late, loudly complaining to the valet, flaunting his expensive watch, and acting as if he owned the entire establishment. He had always rubbed me the wrong way. He talked too fast, promised too much, and always seemed to be looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important had walked into the room. Halfway through our ribeyes, the conversation took a very strange turn. Brooke was talking about a new floral supplier she had found, but Derek was entirely tuned out. He kept tapping his fork against his water glass, his eyes repeatedly shifting to me. Derek leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass with an air of casual indifference. He mentioned that he had been driving through the industrial park the other day, scouting commercial real estate for a tech startup he was supposedly investing in. He claimed he happened to pass by one of my old properties, a place called Warehouse 42. I stopped chewing. I set my fork down very slowly. Externally, I showed absolutely nothing, but inside, every single alarm bell went off. I had never discussed my business assets with Derek. I had never mentioned Warehouse 42 to anyone, not even Brooke. It was a rusted, dilapidated facility sitting on ignored land. There was absolutely no reason, for a venture capitalist to let alone dig through property, run-down area, let alone dig through property records, to link it to me. I asked him about it. I asked him, keeping my expression entirely neutral and slightly puzzled. I told him it was just an old holding property, with nothing inside but dust and rusted pipes, wondering aloud why he was asking. Derek smiled. It was a slick, practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He claimed it was just curiosity, adding that if the junk were cleared out, it would be a prime piece of real estate due to its massive footprint. He suggested that holding on to a liability like that was bad business, citing taxes and debt, and asked if I had ever thought about liquidating it. He mentioned he knew developers who would pay top dollar for the land. I looked at my daughter. Brooke was completely oblivious to the tension, sipping her champagne and smiling at her husband. She genuinely thought he was just trying to be helpful. She believed he was the incredibly successful, wealthy investor he claimed to be. But my gut, instincts honed from decades of dealing with scrap metal thieves, corrupt contractors, and greedy businessmen, told me a completely different story. Why would a man supposedly managing tens of millions in venture capital care about an abandoned warehouse in the Rust Belt? Why was he secretly investigating my private assets? And despite his expensive suit, why did his eyes look so desperately hungry? I picked up my napkin and wiped my mouth. I allowed a slow, harmless, grandfatherly smile to spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that makes a predator believe their prey is completely blind. I told him that I was just a retired old guy, and that the real estate market and developer portfolios were a bit too complex for me these days. I said I'd just let it sit there since it wasn't hurting anyone. I caught a brief, sharp flash of satisfaction in Derek's eyes. He thought I was weak. He thought I was ignorant. He believed he had just discovered a gold mine guarded by an aging fool. But as I sat in that restaurant, matching his fake smile with my own, I became certain of one thing: my daughter had married a fraud. I didn't know what his angle was just yet, or how deep his lies ran, but I fully intended to find out. I was going to tear down his facade piece by piece, until the ugly truth was laid bare for Brooke to see. I paid the bill that night without batting an eye. When the waiter brought the leather check presenter, Derek didn't even make the polite gesture of reaching for his wallet. He just leaned back, patted his stomach, and praised the quality of the Wagyu. I handed over my credit card with a warm smile, playing the part of the generous, satisfied father perfectly. But under the table, my hands were clenched into tight fists. My knuckles, permanently scarred from decades of tearing apart jagged steel, were aching. The drive home was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the Pittsburgh streets slick and reflective under the amber glow of the streetlights. Driving my reliable old truck through the city, my mind drifted back to the early years. It's funny how people like Derek look at me now. See an old guy in a flannel shirt and assume my life has always been as simple as my wardrobe. They have no earthly idea what it takes to build a scrap empire from absolute zero. When Patty and I first got married, we had nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a mountain of debt. I worked 14-hour days in the scrapyard, breathing in the scent of burning copper, diesel, and wet earth until it seeped into my very pores. I tore down foreclosed factories, stripped copper wire from abandoned mills, and hauled iron until my back felt like it would break in two. I did it all for them. Patty come down to the yard at 7 p.m., bringing a thermos of black coffee and 2 sandwiches wrapped in tin foil. We would sit on the tailgate of that battered truck, talking about the future we were building for Brooke. Before Patty passed, I promised her I would never let anyone take away what we built for our little girl. I intended to keep that promise. Men like Derek Thorne despise dirt. Teasy. They recoil at the smell of sweat and grease, yet they are the first to reach out their manicured hands, desperate to claim the money that dirt produces. He thought I was just an old fool hoarding useless industrial land. He failed to realize that in my line of work, you learn how to spot worthless scrap metal disguised as something shiny. I barely slept that night. I sat in my study, the one room in the house that still held the faint, lingering scent of the old yard, staring at the dark oak walls. Why was he asking about that specific warehouse? The holding company that owned it was buried under layers of legal protection. Someone had to be actively digging into my assets to trace that property back to me. The answer arrived at my front door the next morning at exactly 9 a.m. I was in the kitchen brewing a pot of dark roast when the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I found Derek standing on the porch, He was wearing a sharply tailored, deep navy suit, holding an expensive leather briefcase. Hib. Brooke was right beside him, holding his arm and looking up at him with a gaze of blind admiration that made my stomach turn. Derek greeted me with the same bright Emestsumus restaurant, hoping Ian to smile from the restaurant, hoping they weren't interrupting my morning routine. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and welcomed them inside, keeping my voice gentle and inviting. I told them I was just making coffee and asked what brought them over so early on a Saturday. Brooke kissed my cheek and told me with pride that Derek had stayed up half the night working on something for me, and that he wanted to show me something important. I led them into the living room and invited them to sit. Derek smoothly unzipped his briefcase, pulling out a thick, professionally bound financial portfolio with a high-gloss finish, sliding it across the coffee table toward me. It looked like a presentation meant for a corporate boardroom, not a Saturday morning talk with a retired father-in-law. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees to project sincerity. He acknowledged that we had touched on it briefly the night before, but said he couldn't stop thinking about my portfolio. He claimed he had done a deep dive into the county property records for the sake of the family. I picked up the folder. The first page showed an aerial map of the industrial zone, with my property outlined in bright red ink. Next to it was a detailed breakdown of projected property taxes and maintenance liabilities. Derek lowered his tone, adopting an air of false concern, telling me I was bleeding money on a non-performing asset. He argued that while the warehouse sat on prime commercial land, the building itself was a massive liability, costing high commercial taxes for an empty shell. He claimed that as a venture capitalist, it pained him to see capital tied up like that. He told me I was 70 and should be enjoying my retirement instead of paying taxes on rusted metal. I flipped through the pages slowly, pretending to be overwhelmed by the numbers and pie charts. He had done his homework. I'll give him that. But all his calculations were based purely on public tax records. He had absolutely no idea what was actually happening behind those rusted gates. Derek locked his eyes onto mine with a predatory intensity, mentioning that he had developers in his network looking for industrial land in that exact zip code. He offered to facilitate a private sale, promising to take the liability off my hands by the end of the month and inject a massive wave of liquid cash directly into my retirement account. He told me I wouldn't have to lift a finger because he would handle all the paperwork. I looked at Brooke. She squeezed his hand and nodded eagerly, softly telling me he made perfect sense. She brought up how hard I had worked my entire life and said I didn't need the stress of managing abandoned properties. She called Derek a financial genius who knew exactly how to handle these corporate sales, urging me to let him help. Anger flared inside me again, hot and sharp. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my living room, actively helping a parasite attempt to drain my assets. He had completely brainwashed her. He had convinced her that he was our financial savior, a wealthy expert doing us a favor with his brilliant business mind. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his custom suit and throw him into the street. I wanted to demand to know exactly how much debt was hiding behind those expensive clothes. But I forced my shoulders to drop. I let out a long, heavy sigh, playing the exact role he needed me to play. A tired, confused old man. I tapped his glossy report with my calloused fingers and told him it was a lot of information to take in. I explained that I wasn't used to moving this fast, that my accountant usually handled the tax bills, and that I wasn't great with modern financial jargon. Derek smiled, a clear look of victory washing over his face. He assured me I didn't need to understand the jargon, saying that was exactly why he was there. He offered to draft a power of attorney that very afternoon. Just a limited one, so he could negotiate with the buyers on my behalf. I shook my head slowly, handing the folder back to him. I told him I appreciated his hard work, but explained that I was old-fashioned and never signed documents on the same day I received them. I asked him to leave the proposal with me so I could review it carefully with a magnifying glass over the week, suggesting we talk again the following weekend. Derek's smile froze for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened. A flash of impatience slipped through, just enough for me to catch. He was desperate for that money. The urgency was palpable. He recovered quickly, packing up his documents while telling me to take my time, though he cautioned that the real estate market was volatile and buyers wouldn't wait forever. As I walked them to the door, I noticed Derek pause by the entrance to my private study. His gaze drifted past the open door, landing squarely on the heavy vintage steel safe bolted into the corner of the room. He only stared at it for 2 seconds. But those 2 seconds were all the confirmation I needed. He wasn't going to just wait around for me to sign his paperwork. He was looking for another way in. The game was officially on, and I was entirely ready to play. The morning sun cast a bright light across the hardwood floor of my study, illuminating the heavy steel door of my vintage safe. I had been sitting in my leather armchair since dawn, staring at that combination dial, replaying the hungry look in Derek's eyes from the previous evening. People like him simply cannot hide their greed. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The house was dead quiet, exactly the way Patty and I used to enjoy our Sunday mornings. I was just about to head out to the garden to clear my head when the sharp ring of the front doorbell broke the silence. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was just past 8 a.m. Nobody shows up unannounced at this hour unless it's an emergency or a salesman. Wrapping my robe tightly around me, I walked to the foyer. Looking through the peephole, I saw my daughter, Brooke, and her husband standing on the porch. Derek looked like he had stepped straight out of a financial magazine, wearing a crisp, perfectly fitted suit despite it being Sunday morning. He held a thick leather briefcase tightly against his chest. Brooke looked exhausted, holding a cardboard tray of coffees, but she managed a weak smile. I opened the heavy door, forcing a look of pleasant surprise. I welcomed Brooke inside and told her it was quite a shock, adding that she should have called so I could prepare some breakfast. Brooke kissed my cheek as she walked past me into the kitchen, letting me know they had brought pastries. She acknowledged it was early, but explained that Derek had stayed up almost all night working on something for me, noting that he was too excited to even wait until Monday. I turned my attention to Derek, who was standing in my hallway, radiating a false, energetic enthusiasm. He extended his hand, apologizing for the surprise visit, but stating that when an opportunity arises, you have to seize it. I shook his soft, manicured hand, feeling the stark contrast against my own calloused palm. Leading him into the living room, I pointed toward the sofa. Derek sat down, heavily thumping his leather briefcase onto the coffee table. He smoothly unzipped it, pulling out a stack of high-gloss, professionally bound documents, and spreading them across the glass surface. I sat across from him, resting my hands on my knees, perfectly playing the role of the confused, aging father. Derek leaned forward, trying to project absolute sincerity. He noted that we had touched on the matter briefly during dinner the night before, but said he couldn't stop thinking about my holding properties. He explained that he had done a thorough search of the county tax records for the sake of the family's future, hoping I wouldn't mind. I picked up the first folder. The cover displayed an aerial map of the industrial zone, with Warehouse 42 highlighted in bright red ink. Right next to it was a detailed breakdown of projected property taxes, maintenance liabilities, and estimated losses. Derek continued, lowering his voice into a deep tone of artificial concern, telling me I was bleeding heavily on a non-performing asset. He insisted that while the warehouse occupied prime commercial land, the building itself was a major liability, costing high commercial taxes for nothing more than an empty shell. He claimed that as a venture capitalist, it physically pained him to see money tied up that way, adding that at 70, I should be enjoying my retirement, traveling, and relaxing, rather than paying taxes on rusted metal and contaminated soil. I flipped through the pages slowly, acting as though I were completely overwhelmed by the numbers and colorful pie charts. He had definitely put in the work, but his calculations relied entirely on public tax records. He had absolutely no clue what was actually going on behind those rusted doors. Derek locked his eyes onto mine with a predatory intensity, mentioning that he had developers in his private zip code, looking for industrial land in that exact zip code. He offered to arrange a private transaction, promising to take the liability off my hands by the end of the month and place a massive amount of liquid cash straight into my retirement account. He assured me I wouldn't to lift a finger, as he would manage all the documents, lawyers, negotiations, and everything else involved. Brooke walked into the living room, setting down the tray of coffee and pastries. She sat right beside Derek, wrapping her arm around his, and looked at me with an expression that made my stomach turn. Brooke spoke softly, though there was a noticeable edge to her voice, telling me I had to admit he made perfect sense. She reminded me that I had worked hard my whole life and didn't need the stress of managing abandoned properties, pointing out that I wasn't young anymore. She called Derek a financial genius who knew exactly how to navigate these corporate sales, urging me to let him help. The camera feed captured his face with absolute clarity. The polished mask of the successful venture capitalist completely vanished, replaced by the savage, ravenous expression of a scavenger. His eyes tore across the screen, devouring every line of the fabricated email. I watched his jaw drop slightly. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline. $7 million in liquid cash, completely cleared and primed for transfer. This was the exact lifeline he had been desperately searching for. Derek didn't just read the email. He immediately yanked his sleek smartphone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to brace his elbows against his knees just to steady the camera lens. He began snapping photos of the iPad screen, logging the fake account numbers, the routing details, and the contact information for the fictional banking manager. The dam had burst, and his greed was in total control. With cold disgust, I watched as he closed the email app and began frantically swiping through my private device. He opened my digital banking apps, my investment portfolios, and my private text messages. He was hunting for passwords, security questions, anything he could use to drain my assets. He took a photo of every single screen, moving at a frantic, unhinged pace, his thumbs flying across the glass. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was absolutely not a banking error, and it certainly wasn't a caring son-in-law trying to protect his family. Every plausible lie was dead. I was watching a calculated, predatory violation of privacy. I was watching a thief orchestrate the destruction of my life's work. My hands gripped the steering wheel until the leather groaned. I felt a profound, heavy sorrow for Brooke. She was upstairs washing her hair, completely oblivious to the fact that the man she loved was actively to rob her father blind. Derek thought he had hit the ultimate jackpot. He believed he had stumbled upon the key to fixing his monumental financial failures. He had no idea that every single frantic swipe was being recorded and stored on a secure cloud server, building an insurmountable wall of evidence. After 5 minutes of frantic digital looting, the shower upstairs must have stopped. Derek froze. His head snapped up. He hurriedly closed every app on the iPad and placed it back on the exact screen and position where I had left it. Tossing his phone back into his pocket, he grabbed the magazine, leaned back into the sofa cushions, and crossed his legs, adopting a perfectly casual pose. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting toward the stairs one last time, just to be absolutely certain he was safe. He took a deep breath, smoothed his hair, adjusted his collar, and in an instant, transformed back into the supportive, perfect husband. I shut off the app on my phone, letting the screen go dark. The silence inside the truck was absolute. I sat there for a moment, letting the cold reality settle deep into my bones. The hunt was over. The trap had been sprung, and the rat was caught. I wasn't going to let him take the life Patty and I had built. This was my yard, and he had made a fatal mistake. I now had the exact leverage I needed to completely destroy Derek Thorne and sever his parasitic hold on my daughter. I took a deep breath, pushed open the heavy truck door, and began the short walk back to the house. The deception was over, and the time for patience had passed. I was fully prepared to tear down his facade and show Brooke the truth. The morning after I witnessed my son-in-law attempting to steal my digital identity, I told Brooke and Derek I was heading to the store. Instead, I drove my truck to a faded diner, sliding into a corner booth. 10 minutes later, Thomas pulled into the parking lot. He was the private investigator I had used for decades. A man of few words with a natural talent for digging up things people wanted buried deep. He slid into the booth across from me, placing a thick manila folder onto the scratched Formica table. He didn't waste time on small talk, ordering a black coffee and looking at me with somber, tired eyes. He told me I was right to trust my gut on this one, explaining that he had dug into Derek Thorne and his wealth management firm. He revealed that the entire operation was a complete sham, a total illusion built on smoke and mirrors. My hands rested flat on the table as I told him to let me know exactly what we were dealing with. Thomas opened the folder, sliding past a grainy photo of a strip mall. He revealed that Thorne Ventures didn't exist, explaining it was nothing more than a rented P.O. box at a shipping center. There were no corporate offices, no board of directors, and no massive liquid portfolio. He was registered as a sole proprietorship, but he hadn't filed a legitimate corporate tax return in over 3 years. I felt my jaw tighten as I asked how he could afford the custom suits and the rented sports car, wondering how he had managed to deceive Brooke so completely. Thomas pushed another document toward me. He explained that 2 years ago, Derek actually did have money, having received a substantial inheritance from his late grandfather. He had dumped every single cent into a massive cryptocurrency scam, believing he would become a billionaire overnight. Instead, the platform collapsed, and he lost his entire inheritance within 48 hours. My stomach twisted into a heavy knot as I processed that he had lost everything. Thomas leaned forward, correcting me by saying it was actually worse than losing everything. He explained that when Derek lost the inheritance, he tried to chase his losses, borrowing money to buy back into the market in hopes of a miraculous rebound. When traditional banks cut off his credit, he turned to shadow lenders, and he currently owed just over $2 million to a highly dangerous loan shark syndicate out of Chicago. I stared at those red numbers, every piece of the puzzle locking together with sickening clarity. The frantic pacing in the back alley, the absolute terror in his eyes when the tow truck driver threatened to return, the manic attempt to pick the lock on my filing cabinet, and the sheer ecstasy on his face when he saw that fake email about the $7 million transfer. Derek was a marked man. The people he owed didn't send angry letters. They sent muscle to collect, threatening devastating consequences. Thomas spoke softly, warning me that there was more, and that this part would make me want to completely tear him apart. He pulled a final stack of papers from the folder. They were detailed transaction logs, and I instantly recognized the account name. It was the business account for Brooks Floral Boutique. Thomas explained with deep sympathy that he had pulled the financial records for my daughter's shop. He revealed that when they got married, Derek had convinced Brooke to let him handle the bookkeeping, to take the stress off her plates. But instead of managing her accounts, he had been systematically draining them. I picked up the papers, my hands trembling slightly. Over the past 8 months, Derek had been siphoning thousands of dollars out of Brooke's business account every single week. He was moving the money through a maze of shell companies, desperately trying to scrape together enough cash to cover the bare minimum monthly interest payments on his $2 million syndicate debt. Thomas continued, explaining that Derek had stopped paying her commercial lease 3 months ago, which was why her delivery van was nearly repossessed. He had stopped paying her wholesale flower vendors and stopped paying the boutique's utility bills. Her business was completely insolvent. Thomas revealed that she was running on absolute fumes, and by the end of the month, the bank would freeze her accounts, forcing her into total bankruptcy. The air in my lungs turned to ashy. Brooke had built that boutique from nothing. She had spent countless nights at her kitchen table, sketching floral arrangements and building a clientele. It was her dream, her absolute pride and joy. And her husband was bleeding it dry behind her back, just to save his own miserable skin. He was ruining her. I whispered in a gravelly voice that he was using her as a human shield. Thomas pushed the folder toward me, explaining that Derek was drowning, and when people like him start to drown, they will pull down anyone closest to them just to catch one more breath. He noted that Derek targeted me because I was his absolute last resort, seeing my properties and believing he could manipulate me into signing away an asset. He desperately needed a massive payout, and if he didn't get it, the syndicate would come collecting. I reached out, placing my hand over the mantilla folder. I felt a sudden, profound calm wash over me. The same cold, calculating focus I used to feel standing in the scrapyard, preparing to dismantle a massive, dangerous piece of machinery. There was zero room for error, zero room for hesitation. Every single step had to be precise, deliberate, and devastating. Derek had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. He had manipulated my daughter's heart, stolen her hard-earned money, and brought the shadow of violent, dangerous criminals right to our doorstep. He had smiled right into my eyes while actively plotting the destruction of my family. I slid the folder into my briefcase and thanked Thomas, telling him he had done an incredible job. Thomas watched me closely, asking what I planned to do and offering to contact his connections in the Financial Crimes Division to have Derek arrested for fraud by the weekend. I shook my head slowly, finishing my coffee. I told him no, explaining that the authorities would just lock him in a cell, which was far too easy, and allowed an escape. I noted that if he went to jail now, Brooke would view it as a mistake, believing he was just a businessman who got in over his head. She would visit him, pity him, and defend him. I explained that I needed her to see exactly who he was, to see the monster hiding behind the custom suit. I slid out of the booth, stood up, and gripped the handle of my briefcase tightly. Walking out of the diner and back to my old truck, I placed the folder on the empty passenger seat next to the iPad containing the video of Derek trying to ransack my life. The hunt was officially over. It was finally time to execute the plan. I pulled out of the diner parking lot and merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the bustling downtown commercial district. The drive took less than 20 minutes, but my mind ran through 1,000 different scenarios. The manila folder and the silver iPad sat on my passenger seat like unexploded ordnance. Parking my old truck in the underground garage of a sleek glass high-rise, I took the private elevator up to the 14th floor. Mitchell Gallagher had served as my corporate attorney and most trusted confidant for over 25 years. When Patty and I first expanded the recycling business into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, he was the man who navigated the complex legal waters. Mitchell was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who believed implicitly in the absolute power of an airtight contract. His secretary ushered me straight into his spacious corner office. Mitchell rose from behind his massive oak desk with a warm smile, but his expression instantly turned serious when he saw my face. He knew me far too well. He could tell the difference between a social visit and a man preparing for total war. He invited me to sit, noting that I looked ready to tear down a building with my bare hands, and asked what was going on. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. Opening my briefcase, I pulled out the thick manila folder Thomas had given me and placed it squarely on his immaculate desk, setting the iPad right next to it with the hidden camera feed from my living room ready. I told him in an unusually quiet voice that I wanted him to review the financial logs and watch the video, adding that I would wait right here. Mitchell frowned, picking up the heavy folder. Adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses, he began to read. For the first few minutes, the only sound in the office was the steady ticking of his antique wall clock and the crisp turning of pages. I watched his professional composure slip away piece by piece, his jaw tightening and his eyes narrowing in sheer disbelief. When he reached the transaction logs detailing the systematic draining of Brooke's business accounts, he let out a low, heavy breath. Setting the documents down, he pressed play on the iPad screen, watching the high-definition footage of my son-in-law frantically photographing my fabricated bank details, moving through my personal data like a desperate, starving scavenger. When the video ended, Mitchell pushed the tablet away as if it were contaminated. He took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at me with an incredibly heavy, chilling expression. He told me the situation was absolutely catastrophic, his voice dropping into a low, urgent register. He stated that the man wasn't just a fraud but was committing grand larceny against my daughter and trying to breach my secure financial networks. He warned that if the investigation regarding the $2 million syndicate debt was accurate, Derek was pulling incredibly dangerous criminals directly into our family's orbit, insisting we couldn't wait another second. Mitchell reached for his desk phone, his finger hovering over the keypad. He offered to call the Financial Crimes Division immediately, noting he had a contact at the FBI who handled syndicate-related extortion and fraud. He suggested handing over the folder and the video so they could have Derek in handcuffs before dinner, allowing them to freeze his assets, protect Brooks' remaining business capital, and secure a protective order by morning. I told him to put the phone down, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a razor. Mitchell froze, staring at me with pure, unadulterated disbelief. He asked if I had heard what he just said, reminding me that the man owed $2 million to loan sharks and was bleeding Brooke dry. He warned that if Derek realized the bank transfers he photographed on my tablet were fake, he would panic. And desperate people do desperately violent things, insisting we call the police immediately. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on his desk, locking my eyes onto his. I told him that if we called the police now, we would lose everything, carefully weighing every syllable to ensure he understood the gravity of my choice. Mitchell looked completely exasperated, asking why I would think that when the evidence was right there, and he was caught dead to rights. I explained that while I had legal proof, I didn't have emotional proof, keeping my emotions tightly checked. I reminded him that as a lawyer, he viewed the situation through the rigid lens of a courtroom, whereas I was looking through the eyes of a father. I reminded him of how incredibly loyal Brooke is, noting that Derek had spent 2 entire years grooming her, isolating her, and convincing her he was the perfect devoted husband, completely manipulating her reality. I paused, letting the immense weight of my words sink into the quiet room. I asked him what he thought Derek would do if the police kicked down their front door tonight and hauled him away in handcuffs. I called him a master liar who could spin a story fast enough to make your head spin, predicting he would tell Brooke. I framed him because I never liked him. I noted he would claim the iPad incident was just an attempt to help manage my complex accounts, and that the missing money from her shop was just a short-term investment strategy that went wrong. He would play the absolute victim, crying and begging, convincing her that her paranoid, controlling father set him up just to destroy their marriage. Mitchell slowly lowered his hand from the black phone receiver. He leaned back into his heavy leather chair, his expression softening as the brutal reality of that psychological dynamic finally settled in. He muttered that she would absolutely defend him, shaking his head. I confirmed that she would defend him with her last breath, feeling a dull ache in my chest. I explained that she would drain whatever money she had left to hire an expensive defense attorney for him, turning her back on me while he used her blind loyalty to drag the case out in court for years. He would bleed her dry while fighting the charges, and I would lose my daughter forever. I told him I couldn't afford a partial victory, noting that promising Patty to protect our girl meant more than putting him in a cell while he still held her heart, which would be an absolute disaster. Mitchell crossed his arms over his desk and asked what the actual plan was. My voice hardened as I told him I was going to build a trap from which there was no escape, letting Derek hang himself right in my own living room. I explained that Brooke needed to witness his monstrosity with her own eyes, to see the mask drop completely, leaving him exposed with zero room for manipulation. I left Mitchell Gallagher behind his massive oak desk, still staring silently at the frozen iPad screen as if it were a venomous snake. The drive to the industrial zone felt like crossing into an entirely different world, the air thick with the heavy scent of diesel exhaust and burning copper. This was the empire built on rust and sweat that Derek Thorne believed he could steal. I pulled my truck through the heavy chain-link gates of the main scrapyard, the sound of the hydraulic crushers deafening. Main corrugated steel hub, I found Hector Morales waiting for me on the loading dock. Hector had been my warehouse manager for 22 years, running the entire operation with military precision. He asked 0 questions as I led him into the dusty back office. I threw my briefcase onto the battered metal desk and told him to lock the door and shut off the main radio, explaining that I needed absolute quiet. Hector clicked the deadbolt into place, assuring me they were ready for whatever I needed. Sitting in my squeaking office chair, I pulled out a stack of blank official corporate letterhead. The paper was thick, watermarked with the original logo Patty had proudly designed 30 years ago. I told him we needed to manufacture a lie, explaining that I required an inventory manifest that looked highly confidential and incredibly lucrative. Lucrative enough that a desperate man would risk federal prison to steal it. Hector raised a dark, questioning eyebrow, but nodded slowly in agreement, asking what kind of inventory we were talking about. I firmly stated we would use platinum and pure rhodium, the most untraceable, high-yield scrap materials on the market. Taking a slow, deep, steady breath, I knew it was time to corner him. I spent the next 2 grueling hours with Hector crafting the perfect, inescapable bait. We built a detailed logistics manifest. Hector dictated exact chemical weights and extraction codes to make the document look flawlessly authentic. We fabricated a paper trail detailing a massive, off-the-books salvage operation involving decommissioned aerospace components and industrial catalytic converters. According to the document, my company had been hoarding these precious metals over a span of 10 years, stating the materials were unregistered and stored completely off the grid, setting the value at $15 million. Hector pulled a thick document pouch from a storage locker and asked about the location. A cold smile touched my lips as I told him to list the storage location as Warehouse 42. The exact property he was already trying to force me to sell. I noted it made perfect sense, as he would believe I was hoarding the metal there and refusing to sell the land just to avoid exposing the illicit inventory. Hector printed the final documents on the old dot matrix printer in the corner, the faded ink giving the manifest an aged, incredibly confidential appearance. Pulling a red ink stamp from the top drawer, I slammed it onto the top edge of the first page. Highly confidential. Eyes only. I slid the documents into a worn manila envelope, tying the string with a specific knot that I would recognize if it were tampered with. As I walked toward the heavy door, Hector offered a low, incredibly serious warning, telling me to be extremely careful, because 15 million in untraceable metal would make Derek incredibly dangerous, and cornered, starving animals absolutely bite. Stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, I replied that I knew exactly how a cornered animal bites, which was precisely why I was leading him straight into the cage. I drove back to the quiet, affluent suburb, parking my truck in the driveway and walking through the front door with an air of confidence. The house was quiet. Brooke had left a note on the kitchen counter saying she and Derek had gone to the boutique to deal with the tow truck company and sort out their banking error, giving me the perfect opportunity to set the stage. I walked slowly down the long hallway, carefully opening the heavy mahogany door to my private study. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. I stepped up to the fireproof filing cabinet Derek had picked open the night before, pulling open the bottom drawer. I didn't hide the manila envelope at the very bottom, as that would be too difficult to find. I needed him to spot it almost immediately, but I needed him to feel clever for discovering it himself. I strategically tucked the thick manila envelope. Midway between my legitimate tax returns and the original deeds to my properties, letting the red confidentiality stamp peek out just enough to be highly visible in the dim light of the drawer. It was an irresistible beacon for a man searching for salvation. I didn't want him fumbling with tension wrenches again. I wanted him to pull the drawer open and find his prize with absolute ease. Next, I verified the hidden cameras I had installed. The tiny lens inside the smoke detector had a perfect, unobstructed view of the filing cabinet, while the digital clock on the bookshelf captured the doorway, covering every inch of the study. Pulling out my phone, I verified the live feed, the high-definition video immaculate, and ready to record every micro-movement. I stepped out of the study, leaving the door cracked open exactly an inch and a half. It was a subtle invitation, a psychological bait designed to call out to his paranoia and greed. He would walk past that door tonight, see the darkness in that sliver of space, and his addiction to the hunt would force him to step inside. For the rest of the long evening, I played a difficult part, the comforting, completely oblivious father. When Brooke and Derek returned from the boutique, they looked utterly drained. Brooke's eyes were red from crying, while Derek maintained a furious, self-righteous facade, railing against the incompetent banking system, holding their funds hostage. I cooked dinner, offering words of encouragement, and watched him perform. He was a consummate liar, kissing my daughter's forehead and assuring her everything would be resolved by Monday. Beneath the glass table, his right knee kept up a frantic, uncontrollable tremor. That $2 million syndicate debt was eating him alive from the inside out. He was running out of time, running out of lies, and running out of money. He needed a miracle. At exactly 10:30 p.m., they politely excused themselves for the night. I retreated to my bedroom, leaving my door cracked open. I lay flat on the mattress, fully clothed, holding my phone. The screen was dark, but the camera app was primed. I didn't have to wait until 2 a.m. this time. Desperation was accelerating. Right around midnight, the floorboard in the upstairs hallway groaned. Soft footsteps descended the stairs. I raised my phone, unlocked the screen, and tapped the live feed icon. The digital clock camera in the study flickered to life. The heavy mahogany door was slowly, silently pushed open, casting a long shadow across the carpet. Derek Thorne stepped into the room, swallowing the bait and locking his own fate into place. The morning after Derek broke into my study for the second time, the air in the house was thick with an unspoken tension. At breakfast, Derek was practically vibrating with a frantic, barely concealed energy. He drank his coffee too fast, his eyes darting around the room, completely unable to sit still. He told Brooke they needed to get back to the town house, claiming the property management company had finally cleared out the mess from the burst pipe. Brooke looked relieved, completely unaware that her husband was actually rushing to execute an illusory, high-stakes heist. I helped them load their bags into the car, perfectly playing the part of the sad, lonely father saying goodbye to his beloved daughter. I held Brooke tightly, resting my chin on the top of her head, breathing in the floral scent of her hair, promising to visit her boutique later in the week. Then, I turned to Derek. I shook his hand. wishing him luck with his venture capital meetings. As I handed him his heavy leather briefcase, my thumb brushed against the hidden magnetic lining of the side pocket. Earlier that morning, while he was in the shower washing away the sweat of his midnight burglary, I had slipped a microscopic, state-of-the-art audio transmitter deep into the seams of leather. It was the size of a coin, equipped with a long-lasting battery and a cellular network transmitter. I watched them drive out of the driveway, the taillights of his rented sports car disappearing into the distance. I didn't walk back inside. I marched straight to my old truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I opened the secure audio application. The digital interface hummed to life, connecting to the transmitter, buried in Derek's briefcase. For the first 20 minutes, I heard nothing but the ambient drone of the highway and the faint murmur of the radio. Then, the distinct sound of the passenger door opening and closing cut through. He had dropped Brooke off at her shop. The moment she was out of the car, the entire audio environment shifted. The radio was abruptly snapped off. I could hear Derek's breathing. It was heavy, ragged, and frantic, the sound of a man running out of oxygen. I heard the harsh squeal of tires as he accelerated aggressively, driving erratically. A few minutes later, the car slammed to a halt, the transmission grinding into park. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the truck's headrest, and listened. I heard the rapid, chaotic clicking of a smartphone keypad. After 3 rings, a voice picked up. It was a deep, gravelly voice, completely devoid of warmth or professional courtesy, uttering just a single word as it called out his name. Derek let out a shaky breath, his voice pitched high, with sheer desperation as the words spilled out of him. He pleaded with the man, acknowledging the payment was late, and that they were past the grace period, and that they were past him to listen with, claiming he had just found the ultimate jackpot and that it was bigger than anything they had discussed. The gravelly voice cut through his panic like a blunt knife, stating they weren't interested in empty promises. No, nas. The man reminded Derek they gave him 2 weeks to liquidate his wife's business assets and that he missed the deadline, adding that the boss was out of patience. He warned Derek he owed $2 million and had 48 hours to produce the cash, threatening that they would send a crew to collect in blood. Derek shouted into the phone, his voice echoing sharply inside the car cabin, telling him he didn't understand. He insisted he wasn't talking about the flower shop, claiming that place was completely bled dry and couldn't produce another dime. He revealed he was talking about $15 million in unregistered, untraceable industrial platinum. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. I could practically feel the dark, predatory shift in the atmosphere through the audio feed. The loan shark ordered him to explain, his tone suddenly sharp and focused. Derek swallowed hard, his breath trembling against the microphone. He explained that his father-in-law was an old scrap metal hoarder who owned a dozen industrial properties in the city. He admitted. He thought the old man was just a clueless fool sitting on useless real estate, but revealed he had slipped into his private study the night before and found his confidential holding manifests. He claimed the old man had been hoarding decommissioned aerospace components and catalytic converters off the books for a decade, storing a massive stockpile of pure platinum and rhodium at a secure facility on the edge of town called Warehouse 42. He claimed he saw the official documents himself and that it was entirely off the grid, with the government completely unaware of its existence. The loan shark asked if he was saying the old man was sitting on $15 million in raw metal and that he could get access to it, a predatory edge creeping into his voice. Derek insisted he could give them total access. Talking so fast, he was tripping over his words in his desperation to save his own skin. He called me old and trusting, claiming I was practically begging him to manage my assets, and asked for 3 days, just 72 hours. He promised to get the keys to the warehouse, providing exact coordinates, security codes, and floor plans so they could send a crew with transport trucks to take the entire inventory. He suggested they liquidate the metal, with the syndicate taking their $2 million plus an extra $1 million for their trouble, leaving the rest for him, calling it a clean, untraceable ghost operation. There was another long, agonizing pause. I sat in my truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, the leather groaned under the immense pressure. I was listening to the man who shared a bed, with my daughter actively plotting a massive, criminal heist against my family, selling me out to a syndicate to save his own miserable life. The loan shark finally agreed to 3 days, his voice cold and menacing. He warned Derek he had 72 hours to deliver access to the warehouse, threatening that if he was lying or using another pathetic stalling tactic, they wouldn't just break his legs. He added that they would take his wife, noting they knew where her little flower shop was and her daily schedule, threatening to make Derek watch what happens when they are crossed. The air in my lungs turned to jagged glass, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I waited for Derek to defend his wife. I waited for him to tell the loan shark to leave Brooke out of it, to show even a microscopic shred of humanity. Instead, Derek let out a cold, cynical laugh. He told them they could do whatever they wanted with her, his voice entirely stripped of emotion. He urged them to just give him the 3 days to secure the platinum so they could take their cut and he could take his, stating he would be on the first flight to Dubai. I lowered my phone, letting the screen go black as the chilling echo of his final words hung heavily in the quiet cabin of the truck. He was willing to sacrifice his wife. He was completely prepared to hand Brooke over to a ruthless syndicate just to buy himself enough time to flee the country. A cold, dark rage wrapped around my heart, tightening until my chest physically ached. I had suspected he was a greedy, manipulative coward. But hearing him casually discard my daughter's life, like a piece of worthless garbage, stripped away any remaining shred of mercy in my soul. This was no longer just about protecting my financial assets or teaching an arrogant son-in-law a lesson about respect. This was about completely eradicating a dangerous predator who had woven himself into the fabric of my family. With those cold words, he had personally sealed his own fate. I felt no pity for him, only a deep, unshakable resolve to see my plan through to its devastating conclusion. Derek was entirely convinced he held the master hand. He truly believed he had outsmarted a clueless old scrap metal hoarder, coordinating a flawless heist that would erase his debts and finance a luxurious escape to Dubai. He had swallowed the bait whole, treating a fake inventory manifest as absolute gospel, already visualizing millions under my very nose. But Derek was a fool who judged exclusively by appearances. He saw a faded corporate logo and a dusty filing cabinet, assuming he understood the full scope of my operations. He had no earthly idea what Warehouse 42 actually represented. There was absolutely no scrap metal inside that building. There was no secret cache of aerospace components, and certainly no unregistered platinum waiting to be fenced by a street gang. The document he found in my study was a work of pure fiction. While Warehouse 42 held no scrap, it was far from abandoned. 5 years ago, the Industrial Zoning Board approached me with an incredibly lucrative, highly confidential proposal. My primary yard was prime commercial land. But Warehouse 42 sat isolated at the end of a dead-end road, flanked by heavy concrete barriers and a defunct rail line. It was an eyesore to the public, but a tactical goldmine for anyone requiring absolute privacy and heavy security. I had leased the entire facility and the surrounding 3 acres to Federal Armored Transport. They are a premier logistics contractor, tasked with managing and moving massive physical currency shipments for the central banking system. From the outside, the facility looked like a forgotten relic. I deliberately kept the exterior deeply dilapidated. Rusted corrugated steel roofs, bent rolling doors, and thick weeds growing along the chain-link fence. It was a masterpiece of urban camouflage designed to make people look away. Inside those rusted steel doors, however, was a heavily fortified, military-grade staging ground. The concrete walls were reinforced with thick steel plating capable of withstanding explosive breaches. The roof was monitored by thermal imaging drones, and the foundation was lined with seismic sensors. When the central bank moves massive pallets of physical cash across the region, they don't park standard armored trucks in commercial lots. They pull into secure hubs, like Warehouse 42, to transfer cargo and rotate heavily armed security personnel. The building was wired into a silent federal alarm network, directly linked to regional law enforcement dispatch and the FBI. Invisible motion laser sensors crisscrossed the main floor, primed to activate the second the perimeter was breached. Furthermore, a highly trained, fully tactical squad of federal guards was stationed inside the control room, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They carried military assault rifles, fully authorized to use absolute deadly force against any unauthorized intruder attempting to enter the currency vaults. Sitting in the quiet cab of my truck, a slow smile spread across my face as I imagined the spectacular disaster Derek was organizing. He was currently convincing a dangerous gang of shadow lenders to mobilize a professional heist crew, promising them a soft target, guarded only by an old man and some rusty padlocks. He was preparing to lead heavily armed thugs straight into the jaws of a maximum security federal stronghold. By breaking into Warehouse 42, Derek wasn't just plotting a simple theft to cover his cryptocurrency losses. He was coordinating a direct assault on a highly classified Federal Reserve staging facility. The moment he and his hired muscle breached those outer doors, they would trigger the silent alarms. Facing a barrage of motion lasers and a tactical guard unit that wouldn't ask questions, Derek was walking into a first-degree federal felony. There would be no clever negotiations or talking his way out of a holding cell, and no high-priced defense attorney could save him from the crushing weight of a federal prosecution. The government does not negotiate with people who attempt to raid central bank transport hubs. They bury them under decades of mandatory minimum sentences in a maximum security facility. He wanted a final score to finance a flight to Dubai, and I had handed him a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. He had callously decided to let my beloved daughter rot alongside her ruined flower shop, completely indifferent to the emotional and financial destruction he left behind. Now, he would be the one rotting behind thick iron bars, surrounded by the very criminals he stupidly tried to betray. The trap was absolutely flawless, inescapable, and ready snap shut the second he made his move. I turned the ignition key, listening to the stable roar of the engine. Putting the truck into drive, I pulled away from the curb. The countdown had officially begun. I had given him 72 hours to hang himself, and every piece was perfectly arranged on the board. I was going to enjoy every single second of his spectacular, absolute downfall. He dared to threaten my family, thinking I was weak and blind. He was about to learn that real power operates in silence, striking only when victory is entirely guaranteed. The 72 hours dragged by with agonizing slowness, ticking away like a time bomb. During those 3 days, I watched Derek operate with a frantic efficiency. He spent hours locked in the guest room, whispering into his phone as he finalized the logistics of his massive betrayal. He fed Brooke a steady stream of charming lies or just the final hurdles, assuring her that his sudden, late-night meetings were just the final hurdles before a massive venture capital breakthrough. Brooke absorbed every word. That Friday evening, Derek announced he had to attend an after-hours dinner to meet with an international investor. He kissed her cheek and drove away to coordinate a violent heist. I waited a full 2 hours after his departure. At 1:45, I walked into the living room, where Brooke was curled up on the sofa reading a book. I told her to put on her coat, explaining that we needed to take a ride. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Pointing to the grandfather clock in the hallway, she noted how late it was and protested that she was already changed for bed. I kept my voice calm, leaving no room for argument. I simply told her that I had found something belonging to her mother, something deeply important about Patty and their old neighborhood, that I needed to show her right now. Mentioning her mother was the only key capable of bypassing her resistance. Brooke sighed, muttering with slight irritation as she set her book aside and threw a heavy wool coat over her shoulders. She followed me to the driveway and climbed into the passenger seat of my heavy-duty truck. A thick, suffocating silence hung over us during the drive. Brooke stared out the window as we left the pristine lawns of the affluent suburbs behind. The smooth asphalt of the residential district gave way to the cracked roads of the industrial district. Bright streetlights vanished, replaced by flickering fixtures that cast a yellow haze over the decaying landscape. Brooke shifted uneasily in her leather seat, asking exactly where we were going, as her irritation shifted into a subtle anxiety. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, telling her to be patient and explaining that some truths can only be seen in absolute darkness. I navigated the maze of abandoned factories with ease. This was my domain, a world built on rust, sweat, and hard labor that Derek thought he could exploit. Turning onto a narrow access road, flanked by towering corrugated metal walls and crumbling brick, I cut the headlights, letting the heavy vehicle glide silently through the deep shadows until we reached a concealed alleyway. I brought the truck to a halt and shifted into park. The engine idled with a steady hum, the only sound in the desolate area. Brooke stared out the window, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she focused on the massive, run-down building standing directly across from our hidden vantage point. It was Warehouse 42. From our position in the dark alley, the building looked like a forgotten tomb. The exterior walls were caked in decades of grime. The chain-link fence was choked with dead weeds, and the massive rolling doors appeared rusted shut. Brooke turned to me, her face pale in the dim glow of the dashboard. She demanded to know why I had brought her to a deserted scrapyard in the middle of the night. asking what this could possibly have to do with her mother. I didn't answer her right away. Reaching into the thick leather briefcase on the center console, I pulled out my silver iPad, the exact device Derek had frantically photographed 3 days earlier. Tapping the screen, I unlocked it, bypassed my personal email, and opened the encrypted software linked to the security network of Warehouse 42. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the dark cabin with a harsh blue glow. I split the display into a 4-panel grid. 2 panels showed high-definition infrared exterior feeds covering the front gates and the loading dock. The other 2 panels revealed the interior of the warehouse, displaying the spotless, brightly lit, military-grade staging ground Derek knew absolutely nothing about. Turning to my daughter, I looked deep into her confused, frightened eyes. I told her the man she married was no venture capitalist. I revealed that his entire company was just a rented P.O. box at a shipping center, and that he had lost his entire inheritance in a catastrophic financial gamble. I watched the color drain completely from her face as I calmly explained that her husband currently owed just over $2 million to a violent, shadow lending syndicate. I didn't soften the blow. I told her that over the past 8 months, Derek had been systematically draining funds from her floral boutique, pushing her business to the brink of insolvency just to cover the minimum interest payments on his massive hidden debt. Brooke opened her mouth to speak, desperate to deny everything and defend the man she loved, but the words caught in her throat. She could see the unshakable, absolute certainty in my eyes. She knew me too well to think I would manufacture a lie of this magnitude. I held the glowing iPad out to her, my hand perfectly steady. I told her Derek had slipped into my private study, finding a fabricated inventory manifest, detailing $15 million in untraceable platinum stored inside the very warehouse we were parked across from. I explained that Derek had sold that false information to his criminal creditors, orchestrating a heist to save his own skin and secure a one-way ticket out of the country. Brooke stared at the screen, her breathing shallow and erratic. She looked up at the rusted exterior across the street, her brain desperately trying to reconcile the illusion of decay with the high-tech, heavily fortified reality displayed on the tablet. I told her, Warehouse 42 wasn't a scrapyard. I explained it was a highly classified federal armored transport hub used to store currency for the central bank, wired with silent alarms, motion lasers, and guarded by a tactical squad armed with military assault rifles. I gently pressed the iPad into her trembling hands, telling her to watch the screen closely. I explained that the mandatory dinner Derek claimed to attend was actually a rendezvous with a violent heist crew. I told her that in the next few minutes, she was going to watch her husband attempt to breach a federal stronghold, witnessing the illusion shatter to finally see the true monster behind the mask. I placed my hand gently over hers, offering silent comfort as we waited for absolute destruction to land. The trap was finally set. The suffocating silence inside the heavy truck was charged with a terrible, heavy dread. Brooke sat frozen in the passenger seat beside me, her eyes locked onto the glowing screen of the silver iPad on the center console. She held her breath, silently praying to whatever deity would listen, that I was just a crazy, paranoid old man who had made a horrible mistake. I could feel the subtle, terrified tremor pulsing through her small hand beneath mine. The sophisticated, infrared cameras covering the desolate exterior of Warehouse 42 displayed a stark, eerie picture painted entirely in shades of gray and harsh white. On the clean digital display, the heavily rusted chain-link fence looked like a solid wall of pale bone. The agonizing minutes dragged on with a heavy, leaden weight that made it difficult to breathe. Every rhythmic tick of the digital dashboard clock felt like a direct blow to my chest. I knew exactly how desperately my beautiful daughter wanted me to be wrong tonight. Um, um, um. She wanted the charming man she married to be sitting in a bright, upscale downtown restaurant, enjoying a late business dinner with wealthy international investors. She wanted her fragile dream to remain perfectly intact. But beautiful dreams built on a rotting foundation of calculated, endless lies eventually collapse, and that inevitable collapse is never gentle or kind. I stared intently at the display, my expression as hard as granite, patiently waiting for the desperate rat to finally enter the concrete maze I had constructed. At exactly 12:14 a.m., a pair of bright headlights cut across the cracked, uneven pavement of the dark access road. Brooke let out a sharp, involuntary gasp of pure terror, her trembling fingers digging painfully into the soft, leather armrest. A dark, unmarked cargo van pulled to a halt just outside the visible radius of the main street lamps. The suspicious vehicle stopped exactly 50 yards from the heavy perimeter gates of the silent warehouse. The metal side door of the van slid open with a harsh scrape, and three distinct figures immediately emerged into the piercing infrared glare of my hidden security network. They moved together with a predatory, synchronized, and chilling efficiency. Two of the men were massive, broad-shouldered thugs dressed from head to toe in dark, tactical combat gear. They carried heavy, unmistakable assault rifles, slung casually across their wide chests. The third man was visibly smaller, wearing a sharply tailored, dark custom suit that looked completely ridiculous and out of place in the desolate, ruined industrial landscape. It was Derek. He held a massive pair of heavy-duty industrial bolt cutters, gripping them tightly in his right hand. Brooke physically recoiled in the passenger seat, her back pressing hard against the door. A muffled, agonizing sob tore from her dry throat as she stared blankly at the high-definition video feed. There was absolutely no possibility of mistaken identity here, and no reasonable, charming excuse left for him to utilize. The man she genuinely loved, the man who had solemnly promised to protect and cherish her forever, was standing in a desolate, dirty alley with dangerous armed mercenaries, actively preparing to illegally breach a highly classified federal transport hub. I reached out and tapped the audio icon on the bottom corner of the iPad screen, routing the sophisticated parabolic security microphones from the exterior warehouse cameras directly into the surround sound speakers of my truck. A low hiss of electronic static filled the dark cabin for a brief second, quickly replaced by the crisp, incredibly clear audio from the silent street outside. We could hear the heavy, aggressive crunch of their tactical combat boots moving across the loose gravel. We could clearly hear the rhythmic metallic clinking of their heavy gear, shifting against the cold night wind. Then we finally heard Derek's voice, completely stripped of its usual charming, highly polished, and manipulative cadence. He sounded frantic, consumed by an intense greed and frighteningly ruthless. Derek instructed the armed men, gesturing wildly toward the rusted entry, telling them to cut the main steel chains on the perimeter gate quickly. He called me an absolute fool, claiming I relied entirely on heavy steel padlocks and outdated deadbolts to protect an enormous fortune, and assured them there were zero exterior surveillance cameras or electronic security measures on this fence. Sonedly, he noted that once they were safely inside the main concrete courtyard, he had the exact digital access codes needed to unlock the secondary loading dock doors. Lone Shark. The towering loan shark, enforcer standing next to him, let out a low, menacing grunt, casually adjusting the heavy tactical rifle strapped to his chest. The dangerous thug growled, his rough voice vibrating through my truck's interior speakers as he warned Derek they better not be walking blindly into a trap, threatening that, if the massive building was empty, Derek wouldn't survive the night. Derek scoffed loudly, letting out a cold, incredibly arrogant laugh that made my devastated daughter flinch physically in her seat. He assured the man it wasn't empty, his tone dripping with pure, unadulterated greed. He claimed he saw the official, highly classified inventory sheets himself, detailing pure platinum stacked inside the main, holding bays, promising they would load the heavy pallets into the back of the van and vanish long before sunrise. The second armed thug stepped forward aggressively, slamming a massive gloved hand against the rusted wire fencing, asking about his wife. He inquired if Derek was absolutely certain she wouldn't immediately file a missing person report with the local police if he didn't return home tonight, noting a massive police investigation would bring heat they didn't need. Derek didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. The ultimate betrayal spilled from his lips casually, carrying an effortless, breathtaking cruelty. He firmly stated that once they had the platinum, he was gone, telling them to block Brooke's number since she had zero clue what was actually happening. He callously muttered to let her rot alongside her bankrupt flower shop. The silence inside my truck was absolute, stunning, and deep. Brooke stared blankly at the screen, every ounce of color draining from her beautiful face. The perfect illusion she had fought so hard to protect shattered into a million unfixable pieces in an instant. She let out a long, agonizing wail, collapsing forward as her fragile shoulders shook, with violent, uncontrollable sobs. I immediately reached across the center console, pulling my broken daughter tightly into my strong arms. I whispered with absolute conviction, reminding her of the promise I made to her mother that I would never let a man ruin her life and get away with it. We sat in the suffocating darkness of the heavy truck. Brooke slowly pulled back from my chest, her tears stopping, replaced by a cold, hollow numbness settling deep in her eyes. Wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand, she turned her gaze back to the glowing screen of the silver tablet, and then out toward the dilapidated building standing across the street. We watched in absolute silence as the three men moved with calculated precision toward the main entrance of Warehouse 42. Derek walked with a false, arrogant swagger, entirely convinced of his own manufactured brilliance, flanked by the two massive mercenaries whose heavy combat boots crunched softly against the gravel. Derek stopped in front of the main gate. The thick iron chains, locking the rusted steel barriers, looked imposing, but they were nothing more than a fragile illusion. He raised the heavy industrial bolt cutters, locking the steel jaws onto the center link of the chain, and threw his entire weight onto the handles. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the silent alleyway, captured perfectly by the sensitive parabolic microphones and broadcast directly into the cabin of my truck. The severed chain hit the dirt heavily. Derek pushed the iron gates open, the barriers protesting with a long, agonizing shriek of unlubricated hinges. The armed thugs scanned the empty perimeter, raising their assault rifles, completely unaware that multiple high-definition thermal imaging cameras. They crossed the 50 yards at every moment, a tracking doy. Every cracked concrete. They crossed the 50 yards of cracked concrete. Derek led the way toward the massive corrugated rolling doors of the loading dock. This was the exact spot where he believed his ultimate salvation was waiting. He pulled his smartphone from his cust suit pocket. I knew exactly what he was looking at. The photos he had secretly taken in my study, staring at the fabricated access code I had left for him. He stepped up to the weathered keypad mounted on the brick wall next to the door, entering the numeric sequence with eager, trembling fingers. From deep within the belly of the building, a heavy hydraulic hum vibrated. The massive steel door groaned against its heavy industrial tracks, slowly rolling upward. Derek took a confident step forward, a triumphant smile spreading across his face, fully expecting to walk into a dark, quiet room, stacked with wooden pallets of raw platinum, and expected to find his freedom. He expected to find his freedom. He stepped over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes, crossing the invisible plane of the motion lasers. The response was absolute, instantaneous, and completely devastating. The trap didn't just spring. It exploded with immense violence. Before Derek could even take a second step, massive, military-grade floodlights positioned around the entire courtyard perimeter flared to life simultaneously. The sudden, intense illumination turned the pitch-black night into an artificial, blinding day. The light so powerful and aggressive that Brooke and I had to shield our eyes inside the truck. A fraction of a second later, the deafening, bone-rattling wail of a federal emergency siren erupted from the warehouse roof. The sound was a physical force, a terrifying, rhythmic scream designed to disorient and paralyze. On the security screen, Derek froze, his triumphant smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He dropped his smartphone onto the concrete, raising his arms to shield his eyes from the blinding glare. The two seasoned mercenaries behind him instinctively raised their assault rifles, their tactical training kicking in as they desperately searched for targets in chaotic light. But their extensive criminal experience also let them recognize the terrifying reality of their situation immediately. This was no poorly defended scrapyard. They had walked with open eyes straight into a heavily fortified federal stronghold. The heavy tactical steel doors around the warehouse were thrown open, and dozens of highly trained, fully armored federal guards flooded into the blinding light. They moved with incredible speed and absolute military precision, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around the three intruders. They didn't carry standard handguns. They held high-powered, short-barreled assault rifles, every weapon raised and locked firmly onto their targets. A thundering megaphone voice boomed through the heavy speakers, cutting clean through the howling sirens, identifying themselves as federal armored transport and ordering them to drop their weapons immediately or be fired upon. The mercenaries were violent men, but they weren't suicidal. They recognized immediately that they were severely outgunned and entirely outmaneuvered by federal authorities. Without a single second of hesitation, they dropped their heavy rifles onto the concrete, interlacing their fingers behind their heads as they slowly dropped to their knees. knowing that threatening federal transport guards carried a guarantee of lethal force. Derek, however, shattered completely. The slick, manipulative venture capitalist ceased to exist entirely. The man who had callously planned to abandon his wife to a violent syndicate, shrinking into a pathetic, terrified shell. He dropped the heavy bolt cutters, the tool clattering loudly against the pavement. Instead of dropping to his knees, his legs gave out completely, and he collapsed onto the hard ground, falling directly into a shallow puddle of muddy water. Dozens of glowing red laser targets instantly swept across his torso, dancing frantically over the lapels of his expensive custom suit. He held his hands in the air, his body shaking violently as he began to cry. Not a quiet, dignified surrender, but a loud, hysterical, embarrassing wail of pure, unbridled terror. Through the high-definition audio channel, Brooke and I could hear him frantically begging for his life, screaming that it was all a terrible mistake and that he was just a businessman looking for his father-in-law. The federal guards ignored his pathetic pleas. 4 heavily armored officers in, quickly kicking Derek flat onto his stomach in the mud, violently wrenching his arms behind his back to lock heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. I watched as a dark, spreading stain formed across the front of his custom trousers. Under the impact of immediate consequences, Derek Thorne lost total control of his bodily functions. He wet his pants right there in the mud, blubbering like a terrified child, while federal agents stripped away his freedom. I turned my head slightly to look at my daughter. Brooke was staring intently at the iPad screen, completely transfixed by the pathetic, humiliating spectacle unfolding on the concrete. There was no longer any pity in her eyes, and not a single shred of love or affection remained for the man begging in the dirt. The calculated illusion he had carefully cultivated for 2 years was permanently, irreparably shattered. She finally saw the pathetic, cowardly reality of the man who had promised to cherish her forever. Brooke slowly reached out and closed the cover of the iPad, shutting off the video feed. She let out a long, deep breath, releasing a massive weight she had unknowingly carried for years. She looked at me, her beautiful face illuminated by the residual glow of the distant warehouse floodlights, her eyes entirely clear. The next morning, the sun cast a long, pale gold beam across the polished granite countertops of my kitchen. The house was exceptionally quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of federal sirens and screaming mercenaries that had dominated the night before. I stood by the coffee maker, listening to the rhythmic, comforting drip of the dark liquid filling the glass carafe. Brooke sat silently at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped tightly around a warm ceramic mug. She was pale and visibly exhausted, but the painful tension that had gripped her shoulders for the past 2 years was completely gone. The devastating illusion of her perfect marriage had been brutally stripped away, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. We hadn't spoken much since returning from the industrial district. There was no need for long explanations or emotional declarations. She had witnessed the absolute truth with her own eyes, and that truth had irrevocably severed the toxic chain Derek had wrapped around her life. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, savoring the bitter, earthy aroma, and turned to face my daughter. I was just about to ask her what she wanted for breakfast. The silence, when her phone shattered the silence. The device vibrated violently against the solid granite, its harsh electronic ring echoing sharply through the quiet kitchen. Brooke flinched slightly, her eyes darting to the glowing screen. She stared at the flashing display, which showed an unknown, out-of-state number. A sudden look of deep apprehension clouding her features. She reached out slowly and pressed the green button, sliding her thumb across the glass to answer, placing the phone on speaker flat on the counter between us. A cold, automated, and entirely emotionless voice filled the room, announcing a collect call from a county correctional facility from an inmate requesting charges. The automated voice instructed her to press 1 to accept. Brooke looked up at me, her eyes wide and searching. I gave her a firm, definitive nod. She pressed the number 1 on the keypad. The automated voice disconnected instantly, replaced by the frantic, echoing noise of a crowded booking area. Then we heard Derek's voice. He pleaded with her. His voice, a high-pitched, pathetic whine of pure, agonizing desperation. He was sobbing uncontrollably, his words stuttering out in a frantic rush of terror. He claimed it was a massive, horrible misunderstanding, insisting he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He spun a story about driving past my old warehouse when men with guns jumped out of nowhere, claiming the police arrested him by mistake and threw him in a cell with violent criminals. Mard. He begged her to call his lawyer and drain the business accounts to bail him out immediately, crying about federal charges and insisting it was a complete lie to get him out today. I listened to the pathetic, blubbering coward pour his manufactured lies through the speaker. Even now, trapped behind solid steel bars and facing decades in prison, he was still trying to manipulate his wife. He was still desperately trying to use her as a convenient shield to escape the devastating consequences of his own bottomless greed. The very man who had been casually plotting to hand her over to ruthless loan sharks the night before was now begging her to empty her struggling boutique accounts to buy his freedom. The sheer, unadulterated narcissism of it was breathtaking in its shamelessness. I watched Brooke closely. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but her expression didn't soften with pity. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of pure, undeniable disgust. She opened her mouth to respond, ready to unleash the righteous anger she had every right to feel. But I gently placed my hand over hers and slowly shook my head. This wasn't her burden to carry anymore. The final reckoning belonged entirely to me. I picked up the phone from the granite counter and brought it to my ear. Taking a slow, deep breath, I let a cold, unwavering resolve settle into my voice. I greeted Derek, my tone flat and unforgiving, heavy as a block of solid concrete. Shunchant, the frantic, pathetic sobbing on the other end cut off instantly. The silence that followed was so heavy I could almost hear his heart racing through the digital connection. When he finally spoke, his voice was nothing more than a terrified, trembling whisper, breathing out my name as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He demanded to know where Brooke was, why I had her phone, and insisted on speaking to his wife right that second. I told him calmly that Brooke was sitting right next to me, taking a slow sip of my hot coffee. I informed him that she had absolutely nothing to say to him and was completely done listening to his endless, pathetic lies. I let him know we had a highly educational night, taking a lovely scenic drive down to the industrial zone. We parked in a dark alley right across from a certain run-down building, and we watched a highly entertaining show on my security monitor. We watched him confidently attempt to break into a federal transport hub, and we watched him cry like a terrified child when the tactical guards pinned him to the mud. There was a sharp, suffocating gasp on the other end of the line. Derek choked out his words, his voice thick with rising panic, accusing me of setting him up, fabricating the entire inventory manifest, and intentionally leading him straight into a trap. I corrected him smoothly, feeling a deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest. I told him I didn't set him up at all. I explained that I simply held up a mirror, and he eagerly showed me the monstrous reflection of his own bottomless greed. He wanted to steal my legacy and was entirely willing to sacrifice my daughter to violent criminals just to secure his own cowardly escape. I told him he wanted my warehouse, and he got it. But he didn't break into an abandoned scrapyard owned by a clueless old man. He didn't find 15 million in unregistered platinum waiting to be stolen. He broke straight into a highly classified federal currency staging facility, coordinating an armed assault on a U.S. banking transport hub. The men he brought carried illegal assault rifles, triggering a Level 4 federal response. Derek begged and pleaded, his voice breaking entirely into high-pitched, hysterical sobs, imploring me to tell them the truth and help him right now. I let out a low, cold laugh, completely devoid of humor. I told him firmly that I was not going to help him. I told him to enjoy his 25 years in federal prison with no chance of parole, stating that, as far as we were concerned, he no longer existed. Derek let out a scream of despair. I pressed the red button, cutting him number permanently. The bright morning sun shone beautifully through the window. The nightmare was finally over, and our family was safe, secure, and entirely free. Exactly 1 month after that unforgettable night, the dark cloud that had been suffocating our family finally cleared away. Derek was sitting in a cold isolation cell at a maximum security federal detention center, awaiting a highly publicized federal trial. The ruthless loan sharks he had so carelessly tried to double-cross were indicted right alongside him. A federal judge took one look at the overwhelming mountain of evidence and immediately denied Derek any possibility of bail, officially declaring him an extreme flight risk. He was going nowhere. He would soon trade his tailored suits for a bright orange prison jumpsuit. And the man who once thought he was untouchable would soon be nothing more than a forgotten inmate, serving a devastating sentence. On an exceptionally beautiful Thursday morning, I drove my daughter downtown. Brooke sat comfortably in the passenger seat of my truck, her color completely returned. Her posture radiated a quiet, undeniable strength, and the dark shadows beneath her beautiful eyes had completely vanished. The divorce proceedings had moved incredibly fast, surgically cutting Derek out of her life for good. We parked outside a towering glass building and took the silent elevator straight to the top floor. Mitchell Gallagher, my most trusted corporate attorney and a man deeply loyal to my family, was patiently waiting for us in his spacious corner office. Brooke sat back in a comfortable leather armchair, casting a curious, questioning look my way. I walked slowly across the expensive carpet and sat right beside her. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a small velvet pouch, opened it, and placed a heavy brass key squarely on the polished mahogany desk between us. Brooke stared at the ornate key, completely at a loss, softly asking what it was for. I smiled warmly, reaching out to gently cover her hand. I told her that a man who spends his entire life building an empire out of jagged scrap metal learns to hide his most precious treasures exactly where no one would think to look. I explained that Derek foolishly believed my wealth was locked away in a rusted warehouse or exposed in vulnerable, personal bank accounts. But Derek was a deeply superficial creature. He could never comprehend the endless depths of a father's protective instinct. I nodded to Mitchell, who handed Brooke a thick, leather-bound portfolio and told her to open it. Her trembling fingers turned the crisp, heavy pages. She stared at the complex legal documents, trying to process the massive numbers printed in bold black ink. I explained that many years ago, shortly before her mother passed away, we had quietly established an ironclad blind trust completely in her name. The true wealth, the grand culmination of my lifetime of hard work, was entirely segregated legally. It was protected by layers of fierce corporate law that no greedy, manipulative spouse could ever touch. That brass key opened a private vault containing physical bearer bonds and certified asset deeds belonging solely to her. Derek had spent 2 years hunting for a hidden fortune that he didn't even have the legal right to touch. Brooke wept tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. She stood up abruptly, throwing her arms tightly around my neck and burying her face in my shoulder. I held her close, feeling the incredible, undeniable bond between a father and his beloved daughter completely restored. She kept thanking me, but I told her that protecting her was the greatest privilege of my life. Later that week, Brooke officially reopened her floral boutique. Free from the heavy, suffocating anchor of Derek's secret siphoning, the business began to thrive immediately. She hired 2 new assistants to manage the non-stop influx of customer orders, and her vibrant, joyful laughter echoed, once again, through the fragrant, colorful shop. She had finally reclaimed her independence. That Sunday evening, I sat alone on the sturdy wooden porch of my quiet house. The late afternoon sun hung low on the distant horizon, casting a warm, brilliant golden glow across the manicured green lawn. I held a crystal glass filled with rich, amber bourbon. The air was incredibly peaceful, entirely free of the chaotic tension that had once poisoned our lives. Taking a slow sip of the smooth, burning liquid, I let the comforting warmth spread deep into my chest. I looked up at the vast, beautiful, painted sky, feeling a profound presence settle gently over me. I smiled, raised my glass, and offered a silent, solemn toast. I whispered to the gentle breeze, my voice filled with unshakable conviction, letting Patty know I kept my promise and that no one takes what belongs to us. Greed is a blinding poison that makes arrogant men believe they are smarter than everyone else. When you exploit the pure love of a family just to line your own pockets, you inevitably build your own inescapable cage. True wealth isn't found in secret warehouses, stolen accounts, or fabricated lies. It is forged through decades of honest sweat, unwavering loyalty, and a father's unyielding instinct to protect his family. Never underestimate a quiet man who spent his life building an empire from simple scrap. He knows exactly how to dispose of the garbage that threatens the family he loves. If this story proves that karma always comes to collect, hit that like button. Have you ever had to deal with a toxic partner or a greedy person trying to tear your family apart? Your experience. Sherry subscribes in the comments below. And please some powerful real-life stories every single day.